Hello, everyone. This is criminal profiler Pat Brown. And what I'm going to be bringing to you today, which is, let me get my date straight here, Tuesday, May 9th in the United States. Um, I'm going to be bringing you a 10-part series on Cleopatra based on my book, The Murder of Cleopatra. This book here, which you can find, by the way, on Amazon. Um, and the reason I'm bringing this out now is because tomorrow on Wednesday, which will be May 10th, Netflix is coming out with a new documentary. Um, Already there's a lot of argument about that particular documentary because Cleopatra is being portrayed as a Black woman. Um, and so a lot of Egyptians are very upset about this. A lot of historians are very upset about this. Why? Because according to everything we know and have studied about Cleopatra, she is a Macedonian Greek. I'm going to discuss more of that later on in my 10-part series here, but I just want to point out why people are getting upset, because history is an interesting thing. There is the traditional history that sometimes has gone on for ages, being repeated over and over again as essentially that's it. It's absolutely this way. And then over time, sometimes people challenge the history as we know it. So I do not object to the Netflix series offering a new view of Cleopatra, except that I don't believe it's going to be based on fact. Now, this is the night before that documentary comes out. So what I'm going to do today is do the introduction to my 10-part series. I tell you why I wrote this book, talk about what I'm going to talk about in the next 10 parts of this series. And by the way, it might be 9 parts, it might be 11 parts, because if anybody knows me, I don't plan ahead really well. I do a lot of things off the cuff. So I'm looking at 10 parts, but we'll see what happens. So let me start with who I am. So the introduction here is why I got involved with the Cleopatra story, and who I am to get involved with the Cleopatra story, my history and connection to the study of of Cleopatra's life and death. So let me start with the 2 things I've been involved with. One, the first thing that got me involved was the documentary. It was produced by Atlantic Productions. And it aired on Discovery Channel. It was called The Mysterious Death of Cleopatra. And let me read you just basically what it was about. This is from Atlantic Productions. It says, shedding light on an ancient legend, a special investigation uses recent discoveries to reveal that Cleopatra's death may not, in fact, have been a suicide. Egypt's last pharaoh, the ancient world's most famous woman, the lover of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and ruler of the Egyptian Empire. This is the historical image of Cleopatra, a woman who died for love, the victim of a self-inflicted snake bite. Now, 2,000 years after her death, this special investigation penetrates the distant past and sheds new light on Cleopatra's extraordinary life and her mysterious death. Top U.S. criminal profiler Pat Brown and a team of experts in archaeology and toxicology, psychology and Egyptology re-examine the suicide story and find that all the leads point to a very different story: the murder of the Egyptian queen. The team identify a prime suspect, a man who had everything to gain by Cleopatra's death. So, the Mysterious Death of Cleopatra combines modern criminal profiling techniques, stylish dramatizations, and state-of-the-art CGI, well, state-of-the-art back in 2003, to investigate the most famous suicide in history. History is rewritten as a compelling case for murder is presented. All right. So I participated in this documentary, and what happened is essentially that, as I point out in my book, because I try to be honest, I actually had no, shall I say, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about Cleopatra. Now, I have worked on cold cases, and this one is 2,000 years old, so that's really frozen. But I'd never looked into it. Historical cases, yes, I'm interested in them, but I hadn't actually looked at Cleopatra at that point in time. And Discovery Channel called me and said, "Hey, we're thinking of doing something about her death. What do you think?" And I'm like, "You have to understand, I've worked in the television industry a while, and they sit around a table and say, what can we come up with that's going to be like, exciting for people, something new. They don't even care if it's factual or true. They just anything. O.J. Simpson really didn't kill Nicole. Yeah, anything. So just to make a documentary that's explosive." And I told them, look, I'm not going to do anything I don't believe in. And so I studied Cleopatra's demise. And after I did that, I was shocked at what I'd read in the historical books on it. I was like, you got to be kidding me. And I called them back and said, I'm in. And so I did the documentary, and I eliminated the snake as the cause of death for Cleopatra. She did not die of a snake bite. There's zero evidence to support that. And one of my shows, one of these 10 videos is going to be on the whole snake issue. But I determined that did not happen. I had a tremendous amount of evidence it didn't happen. I presented that during the show on Discovery Channel. And here's what's fascinating. Prior to the Discovery documentary, not one historian was saying that she died of anything but a cobra bite. It was across the board that every single historian said the same thing. Oh, so, she committed suicide. A cobra was brought in to the tomb she was staying in with her two handmaidens, and she got bitten by a snake, and then her handmaidens got bitten by the snake, and they all died. Across the board. After the documentary, everything has changed. You will see that the snake no longer exists in the history of Cleopatra. Now they're going for poison. They're like, okay, she snuck poison in. Now, what's fascinating, and I'm pointing this out because you have to understand how things work. If you read an awful lot of these historians' works, and I have never seen my name mentioned or the Discovery Channel documentary mentioned. I've vanished. What's happened is they're discovering for themselves that Cleopatra didn't use a snake. And which is interesting because in academia, you're always supposed to quote your sources. And there's nothing wrong with quoting a source and saying, hey, I saw the documentary. I think Pat Brown did a good job in analysis, and I've changed my mind. And then you add to that. You add your own stuff to that, and then maybe somebody will quote you the next time. So you're supposed to be quoting other people who give you information. But that doesn't necessarily happen when you're not part of the community, and I'm not a historian. I'm going to get to that in a minute. So that's what happened. I did this documentary, but I was left with thinking, who I believe she was murdered. And then what about that? And so I spent years researching it. And in 2010, I was able to put out this book, The Murder of Cleopatra. Was it well received? Not really. It's always a disappointment when you're like, dang it all. I mean, I think it's a great book, but it was not well received by shall we say, the academic community, the Egyptologists, the historians, because I am not an Egyptologist I always say have problems with that historian word. I like saying an historian, like I think the Brits say an historian, but in the US, you're supposed to say a historian. It doesn't work for me. But anyway, I'm not one of those. And so consequently, I think I didn't get a lot of play for the book. There was mostly like, yeah, whatever. And some people say, well, she's just got sour grapes and she's bitter. Okay, you can go there. Because, of course, it is disappointing. That's all I can say. It's always disappointing when you've worked so hard for something and it's not received in the way you'd like to be received. And why did I want it to be received in a positive way? Because I'm absolutely 100% correct? No. But because I offered something based on evidence that I think was really valuable. All right, so let's get into a couple of reasons of why I did this and who I am, because I think it's important to understand that before you go on the rest of this. So why did I analyze the life and death of Cleopatra? And what impact might my analysis have on how we view the last Pharaoh of Egypt? All right, okay, hold on a second. I'm getting hot. And all right, I'm getting, let me set up here. Clothing issues again. Okay, so why? Well, some people have said, oh, she's a feminist. She just wants to present Cleopatra in a different light, because the original historical versions of Cleopatra were highly, shall we say, insulting, that she was basically a vamp and overly emotional and all kinds of very female things. And she was, she suckered the Roman men, Caesar and Mark Antony into her little web, all that kind of nonsense. And now I've come out with this feminist version. Now, I never had any reason to bring a feminist version to light. That's never what I do as a criminal profiler. What I bring to light is I look at the evidence and say, what do I think happened? That's it. So that is not why I did this. I didn't set out to prove anything that wasn't supported by evidence. Okay. I analyzed this crime because I found it fascinating. I found that for 2,000 years, the same story had been repeated over and over and over and over by the historians. And I was asked to do I went to it was an archaeological group, and I can't remember the name. It was a big one. It was in DC, and all these archaeologists showed up with a lot of Egyptologists there. And I was invited because a man who ran the thing loved the book. And he brought me in front of the people to explain a number of the different, what I consider myths of Cleopatra and how I demolished them. And one of the things I said to them was this. For 2,000 years, people have said Cleopatra was bitten by a snake. And then in 2004, when the documentary came out from Discovery Channel, U.S. criminal profiler Pat Brown proved that wrong. And everybody changed their mind. Does that mean I have a genius IQ? Am I a member of Mensa? No. I'm not even an Egyptologist or a historian. I wasn't any of those things. So why would I, a criminal profiler, come up with this after 2,000 years of people saying otherwise? And I'm going to say why. It's because a lot of times we tell stories, but we don't analyze the stories we tell. We don't look to see if the evidence supports that. Back in the day, there were three main ancient historians who told the story of Cleopatra. You had Plutarch, you had Suetonius, and you had Cassius Dio. They were all Romans. Well, Rome conquered Egypt. So, if you're going to write a story, and they weren't, by the way, these three guys weren't alive at the time of Cleopatra. It was decades later they wrote these books and the stories thereof. So they weren't there. They wrote a story that Rome would like. The only person that was actually there at the time, there was only one fellow, and he wrote, his name was Strabo. He was Greek, and he was alive at the time of Cleopatra. And I got some fascinating information from his writings, because he actually saw what was going on in the geography and in not a lot about Cleopatra, but enough. It was fascinating. Only one. But I don't see the historians quoting Strabo. They're quoting the other three guys. And Plutarch is the one they quote most, because he has very, very, I call him the Dan Brown of that time. He fictionalized a whole heck of a lot of stuff to make a good story. And people liked the story because they were Romans. And over time, people said, oh, yes, well, they're ancient historians. Was he an ancient historian, or was he kind of like a fiction writer? And did what he wrote make sense? And so that's part of the problem, is that I came at this from a completely different viewpoint. I came at this from the viewpoint of a criminal profiler, not from the viewpoint of an historian or a historian. I look at evidence. I don't care how cold the evidence is. I don't care when it happened, but I look at the evidence and I say, does this make sense? Is there logic here or not? And that is what fascinated me about this particular story, because what I read about Cleopatra was so fantastical, and it was absolutely impossible for most of the things they said happened, and it did not match the times. It did not match the geographical issues. It did not match. There's so many issues it didn't match, and I'm going to get into each one of those in the episodes. That I became fascinated how the story just went on as is. Like, well, let's just tell the story again, and let's not pay attention to any of the facts. And I think it's because I came at it from a criminal profiling point of view. But that's not always appreciated. So why do I think now my analysis is important? Not because it shows Cleopatra as a brilliant woman in history, but she is. But because it's more interesting and it makes more sense. And actually, Cleopatra, oh my gosh, as she has been presented, I could do it in a sentence. Cleopatra was the last pharaoh of Egypt. She hooked up with Caesar, and then that went bad when Caesar got killed. So she hooked up with Mark Antony, and then she and Mark Antony tried to take over. So they went to Actium, and oh my gosh, they were starting to fight, and then Cleopatra just left Mark Antony in the middle of the battle and ran off with her ships. And then poor Mark Antony, he was so in love that he followed Cleopatra to Egypt. And then they didn't know what to do, because they were, things were going badly, and they lost a lot of their ships, and they knew Octavian was going to come after them. So they drank a lot and had a lot of sex, I think, and waited for the day when Octavian would show up, and he did. And then Mark Antony killed himself, and then Cleopatra killed herself. Oh, how sad. That's the story, and it's ridiculous, because Cleopatra was a brilliant, close to psychopathic, very, very astute, vicious ruler who was going to fight to keep her Egypt. And I'm not going to say whether she did it for her people or herself. She fought to keep Egypt. She had brilliant tactics, and she had bad luck. That's how she lost. If anything, if some small thing had changed, a small thing about the weather, mostly the weather, that's what did Cleopatra in. Octavian got lucky, Cleopatra didn't. And everybody's ignored that. And it's such a fascinating story, the real story. And I believe I can support the real story with my book. Now, let me point this out. All right. The old who am I to analyze Cleopatra if I'm not a historian? Because everybody has the right to analyze something as long as I provide evidence. Now, one of the interesting things that happened when my book came out, oh Lord, I got attacked. I got the ad hominem attacks, which I usually get quite often. And I don't have a problem with people disagreeing with me, providing evidence and saying, this is my theory. You have this theory. I disagree. This is my theory. Fine. This is your evidence. This is my evidence. Then we can have a proper discussion, a proper debate, a little decorum. That's often not what happens. So if you go on Amazon, it's like, well, Pat Brown, 1 star. And one of the things they say, which just fascinates me, is that Pat Brown just popped out of absolutely nowhere, made up a whole bunch of crap, and didn't even bother to do any research. All right. I'm going to read you a couple things from this book. I just want to illuminate. And this is my book, so I'm not reading my whole book here, by the way. It's a very long book, and I did massive research for this book. And I'm not going to read this book on YouTube, even though it is my own book. I am aware of the copyright issues with a publisher, so I'm just going to do a few little excerpts because I think they make my point. And I encourage everybody to buy the book to get the rest of the points, because I'm not going to do the in-depth thing. My 10 shows are not going to be in depth. I'm going to pick something from each one of these major chapters to point out some of the most important points. And then you're going to have to read this to get all the details, because I can't possibly do that in a YouTube show. At least I'm not going to spend hundreds of hours doing it. So, but I want you to understand the basics and how with logic, how clear it is that most of the history of Cleopatra is nonsense. All right, so I just want to read this from the beginning. I want to say here, one of the things I point out in a note to the reader is that I'm not doing I'm not putting the entire history of Rome and Egypt in here. There are other places to get that, and I'm not providing that here. I recommend that Joyce Tilsley's Cleopatra, her other books on the queens of Egypt, Michael Grant's Cleopatra, Anthony Everett's Augustus, Jean-Yves Emperor's Alexander Rediscovered. I recommend The Genius of Alexander the Great from N.G.L. Hammond, Adrian Goldsworthy's Caesar, Peter Green's The Hellenistic Age, and any of Zahi Hawass's book on Egypt and archaeology, and the books of Said and Jocelyn Gahari on the Egyptian tombs and monuments. And that helps you understand the entire history. So that's in here where you can go and find all that information, because I do recognize people that come before me and have great information. Something else I would like to say, people wonder about, again, have I been, do I know anything about Cleopatra? A lot of people who do history do not go to the location. That's me. I'm at location. I spent a month with Discovery Channel in Egypt. And when I went back to Egypt, let's see, how many years later? 5 years later, I spent a month in Egypt and left right before the revolution hit. And I met a lot of people. I went to a lot of locations in order to analyze a lot of the issues that I was going to be looking at in this book. So I want to thank Dr. Zahi Hawass, who oversees everything archaeological in Egypt and who saw me without an appointment and who set up my wonderful trip to Taposaurus Magna. And this is me with an archaeologist here. They were looking for Cleopatra's grave. Haven't found it yet, but they were looking. And my utmost thanks to Dr. Said Gahari, whose hospitality and conversation, along with his lovely wife, Dr. Jocelyn Gahari, made both my trips to Egypt so very special. Dr. Gahari is in the Discovery Channel show, which I'll have a link to below. They were fabulous. So was I there in Egypt? Yes, I was. Now, the other complaint I get, and people are going to sit here and say, well, why do you need to defend yourself, Pat? I'm not defending myself. I'm trying to help you understand that if you're going to read my stuff, that there's some legitimacy to my work, that I put great research into this, even though people said, oh, she never researched anything. And once somebody actually said I didn't do any research, I had no sources. I would like to introduce you to my sources. This is my bibliography. That's page 1, page 2 and 3, and page 4 and 5. I counted them, 93 sources. And these aren't crappy sources. I owned a whole wall of Cleopatra books, which I read a great deal of. And there are some, of course, internet sources as well. And also, I made sure that I put many footnotes in the book so that when I'm talking about something, you can see where it comes from. Here we have Strabo. I got this in chapter 18, Strabo, the geography of Strabo. And then we have Plutarch, and then we have Summers, ancient Egyptian construction and architecture. And then we have Sergio I can't pronounce his name, Pernagoti. It's called the Egyptians. So I put footnotes everywhere. So I say this because I want you to understand that I worked very hard on this. I researched it. Many months of research. Well, this took me longer to write this book than anything else. Now, again, you can disagree with my research. You can disagree with not my research. You can disagree with my analysis. I don't have an issue with that. But I want you, if you're going to do so, in one of these comments below. You better put your what evidence you have to support that and what your sources are. so so that's basically what I wanted to say for the introduction. Now, oh, one more thing. This is what I got rid of the snake. All right. So the snake is gone, and that's going to be one of the shows. But I want to tell you what else I came to a conclusion about, which is what this whole book, the reason I wrote this book. If any of you know the history of Cleopatra, you're going to say, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? No, I'm not. And I have evidence to support every one of my conclusions. I believe it's good evidence. Along with the snake not killing off Cleopatra, I believe Cleopatra was tortured. I believe Cleopatra was strangled. I believe Antony was murdered. I believe Cleopatra did not hide in her tomb with her treasure. I believe Cleopatra did not bargain with Octavian to save her life. I believe Cleopatra planned a brilliant military maneuver at Alexandria, her Actium II, and you're not going to understand this till I show you what Actium I was. The whole issue of Actium and what they claimed happened there is nonsense to me. But it is very relevant what she did there as to what I think happened in Alexandria later, when at the very end of everything, when Octavian was attacking Alexandria. I believe she planned an Actium II. And you say, you're not going to understand this to you. I bring all of this to you. That was her Actium II, which this time would not have been an escape strategy from a failed naval battle, but a faux naval battle to permit a successful escape from a dire military position that offered little hope of survival. I also believe that Cleopatra never loved Antony. I believe Cleopatra never loved Julius Caesar. I believe Cleopatra did not have Caesar's son, Caesarion. I don't believe that was Caesar's son. I believe Cleopatra may have been one of the most brilliant, cold-blooded, iron-willed rulers in history. And the truth about what really happened was hidden behind a veil of propaganda and lies set in motion by her murderer, Octavian, now the new head of the Roman Empire, and the agenda of the Roman Empire. And I believe my book, I present a tremendous amount of evidence to prove each one of my points in this book. Am I going to present every one of those points in this series? No, it's just too much. It's way too much. But I'm going to present some of the major points and some of what actually proves these things. And you're going to be going, oh my gosh, that's ridiculous. How did they ever come up with that? I'm like, exactly. And I've been shocked all these years that the stories that keep going and going and going that I think are absolutely ludicrous. So that's what I'm going to be doing. So I'm going to end this now. I will be watching the Netflix documentary, probably in tremendous pain. When it shows up, I'll probably be up at 1 o'clock in the morning if that's when it airs on the 10th, May 10th, and see how appalled I actually am. But because that's coming out, and because I have not seen anything in all these years that have been an improvement over when I did the Discovery documentary. And by the way, you may wonder if I did that documentary, did I have any interest in my book being optioned by television to do a series, another documentary series? And the answer to that is yes. Actually, I had a production company. We were going to do 4 to 6 shows in a series, going through the whole book and all the things in it. And unfortunately, when the revolution happened, they couldn't get insurance to go to Egypt. And so the whole plan just caved in. And have I waited since then for another production company to come through? Yeah, I have. It's been over a decade. I'm getting older and older by the day. It's like, can you show up before I'm 95? Would I like to do a full series with television so I can show those that what as Discovery Channel said, these great 3D things, and really help you understand things with visuals and be able to go back to Egypt and point to these things. Would I love that? Absolutely. That'd be my dream. But people say, well, then why don't you call the production companies and call Discovery Channel? Well, that's not the way television industry works. That you can, your book's out there. You can have your literary agent try to send stuff out, and it's just sometimes you get lucky, and sometimes you just don't, and sometimes you just have to wait for them to come to you. So I hope maybe with this series, one of those production companies will come back to me. I would love to do a very thorough series on this, because I think it would change the way people look at the history of Cleopatra, and it should change the way people look at Cleopatra. She's not a particularly nice human being, but she was brilliant, and she could have won. As I point out, she had bad luck, and people never talk about the bad luck she had. She had super bad luck, and Octavian had great luck, and she's like, she must have gone, are you kidding me? Because she did everything she could, and things went bad. And it wasn't for lack of trying, and it wasn't for lack of expertise and clever planning. It wasn't any of that. She was brilliant. Things didn't go well. No, they didn't. So I want people to see the real Cleopatra, not for any agenda, just because it's a fascinating story about a fascinating a pharaoh. The likes we never saw again. So I hope to present at least some of the basic concepts, the basic issues during the show, present basic evidence to support it. But again, if you want the full story, you got to read the book, because I can't go into say the level of detail that I do in the book. And of course, again, I think it's very important that anytime you present something, it's extremely well explained, and you have sources to back it. And because I don't think you should just believe somebody because they're somebody, that's pointless to me. So reading the book, you'll really get all of it, all the details. So anyway, thank you very much for being here. If you're new to the channel, please do like and subscribe. And I will see you for the next, theoretically, 10 more episodes of this particular show. And yeah, I'll see you for the next one, which is I'm probably going to put out tomorrow after I watch the Netflix series. So bye, everybody.